Hey, what's up, guys? It's Mixed by 8i, mixedby8i.vision, and today I want to go into what a channel strip actually is. Let me get this on the edit screen so you're not bombarded with everything. But we're going to talk about channel strips, right? So I love channel strips. That's why I'm excited to talk to you about it. And it's one of my favorite things. I think it's a heaven send, okay, for an engineer like me. All right, what are channel strips for those who don't know? It's going to be one specific plugin, or in this case, on a mixing console. If you looked at a mixing console, it was one single track or single channel that had everything that you needed, essentially, to make the mix balanced, okay? So rather than have 4 different plugins or 5 different plugins doing, one specific task, you could have essentially one plugin or one channel if you didn't have much outboard gear, and that was usually most of the time the case. If I'm working with 64 tracks, I don't have 64 compressors, I don't have 64 EQs, but I have this channel that has all of that on this board, and it allows me to do it and mix from the board. And in this case, I have a plugin that allows me to do 4 or 5 functions from one plugin. And it doesn't mean that you use every single channel strip, because that's not the goal. The goal is to do as little as possible to get the mix sounding balanced. And you'll find that you don't have to do a lot to get a mix balance. In its essence, it's a simple form of EQ, which is going to be your tonal balance, dynamics, which is going to be your compressor and your gate, and it's going to be a leveling thing. So you have all of this on one single plugin. Let's talk about the functions of this plugin. This is the Waves SSL EV2. Let's talk about the input section. So every console is going to have your input. All right. You didn't have mic pre's, and you didn't have, especially 48 to 64 mic pre's. So you had those functions at the beginning of each console, and you still have those functions at the beginning of each console. But, anything that was after, that was brought up to line level, and you wanted to add or take away just a little bit more of that gain, that's what that line knob is. So it doesn't add any of the harmonics or anything. It has very little harmonics. So it's basically like turning up a headphone on a headphone mix. You have the mic, which the mic setting is basically emulating the mic pre that you would use, because basically everything was routed into this one console. So like I said, you didn't have 48 or 64 mic pre's. You had to use what was on the board. So that's not to say that you're sacrificing quality, because the SSL mic pre's are outstanding. Okay, so a lot of times I use this mic pre these days because your USB audio interface, or your audio interface in general, is going to have mic pre's that are built in, but they're too clean. So I like to use this mic pre setting if I feel like a vocal or a signal is just coming in too clean. Okay, I like dirty, gritty sounds. Okay, and that mic pre allows me to do that. Sometimes I hit this 20 dB pad, which just cuts the signal down by 20 dB. Very noticeable difference. And then I just start over, so I'm able to crank this mic knob up as much as I need to, and it adds that mic pre sound from the SSL console. Moving on, you have this phase reverse button, which basically was built to flip the phase of a signal. The idea behind this was, if you're using 2 mics that are pointing pretty much at each other, the distance, without sounding too scientific or nerdy, the distance between the incoming signal coming into both mics would set a waveform that almost canceled each other out. So in theory, or not in theory, in practice, you would flip the phase of one of those mics, and it would bring back, it would, reverse or flip the phase, making it sound full as you recorded it. From there, you would move down to the filter section. I don't know about any other channels. I spent a lot of my time using the SSL channel. But in the filter section, SSL gives you two options, okay? And basically filtering is just how you hear it. It just filters out certain frequencies. So you have a high pass filter, which just takes out a lot of the lows up to the frequency that you want. And you have the low pass filter, which just does the opposite. It takes away those low frequencies that you don't want. It cuts them out, okay? So in saying that, the filtering section of the SSL allows you to either do all of that before processing or right after processing. So right now, its default setting is happening after filtering, happening after the processing. In a lot of cases, you don't want that. So I like to use this split button. And what that split button does is it just takes that filter from happening after the processing and it moves it up to happening before the processing. Let's talk about the EQ section. And you'll notice that I'm jumping around this plugin, and I'm doing that for a reason, because I want to give you insight on how the circuitry works or should work on the SSL channel. So I'm moving to the EQ section, and you'll see we have 4 bands, which allows us to move or sweep across frequencies. All right, we start with our high frequency, and that's going to be a range of 1.5 kilohertz all the way up to 16 kilohertz. By default, this is going to be a shelf EQ. So you're basically raising 8K. And that's the default. You're basically raising 8K and above. And you can go all the way down to 1.5 and above, or 16K and above. Alternatively, you can hit this bell button, and it just only simply turns from a shelf to a bell curve. So you're only affecting around that frequency, okay? I think it is still a wide bell. So, you know, it still sounds a bit musical, but regardless, you go from a bell to a shelf. I like to keep that on shelf unless I know the sound that I want. And then I just use the bell. All right, moving on, you got the high mid frequency section, and that's just basically giving you a range of 600 hertz to 7K hertz. You'll notice you get an extra knob here, and that's just basically changing the width of your bell curve. We can set it to a very narrow curve, which on the SSL is not going to be as narrow as what we can do today with things like the Fab filter, or you know, the Q10 or the F6. It's not going to be as narrow as that, but nonetheless, it is a narrower curve. So the ideal would be that you would use a more narrow curve for the more surgical cuts, okay, or the more surgical boost, but I wouldn't recommend going for a narrow Q doing that. I would recommend the alternative, which would be a more wider Q when you're talking about boosting. Okay, and that way you can still keep that musicality of the signal. Okay, so that's all that extra knob does. We have the low mid frequency. Okay, and that allows us to affect everything from 200 hertz to 2.5 kilohertz. Okay, all right, and then we also have another bell curve, or you know, a curve adjuster here, as I like to call it. Then we move down to the low frequencies, and we're able to affect 30 hertz all the way up to 450 hertz. And just like the high frequency knob, we don't have that Q, but that's because we have a shelf. Okay, so this is another shelf. All right, so you can boost frequencies above 30 or above 450 to get more musical, or take away a lot of that low end rumble that I don't like. And then you can also turn it back into a bell. Okay, and I like that. I like to have those options. I'm limited in options. It doesn't mean that I have all the control in the world, but that's okay. If I can get it to sound good with these 4 EQs, or these 4 sections, I'm pretty much happy. Moving on, we have our dynamic section. Okay, so from our dynamic section, we have our compressor. Okay, and this is going to be a VCA style compressor. So VCA are voltage control amplifiers, and it gives us a lot more control, such as a threshold and the release and the attack and the ratio. So we have all the basic functions of pretty much a regular modern day compressor. You might be like, well, where's the attack? That's below here. So you got two options when it comes to the attack. You can have it at the default, which just gives you a 30 millisecond attack, I believe. But if you click this button down here that says fast attack, well, F attack, that gives you a faster attack. And I believe it goes from 30 milliseconds to now 3 milliseconds. I'm not sure. But regardless, it is faster. It grabs that transient a lot more. Very perfect. Then we move down to the expander and the gate section. And that's just basically a noise gate or an expander that allows you to expand on the signal. And the expander to me sounds more natural, but I do use the gate sometimes. A lot of times I'm working with natural drum sounds, and I'm working with larger tracks, larger bands, so they have mic bleed, or in this case you might be recording and you have headphone bleed. You might want to cut out those breaths, and you don't want to spend time cutting out every single breath. Well, a gate is going to be your best option, and you have that on this channel strip. Okay, so the gate is going to allow you to set the threshold, which in this case, the higher up you go, the more signal it takes for that gate to open up. Otherwise, anything below that gate doesn't get heard, or gets heard very little, as you'll see within our next knob. So we have our range, which is our next knob, and that just tells the gate by how much to reduce this signal. Okay, so we can set that however we want. So we got 0 all the way down to cutting that signal by -40 dB when it's not above the threshold. Very perfect for cutting out that mic bleed. You might think that we go from input down to dynamics, down to filter, and down from EQ. By default, we go from the input, then we go into dynamics, then we go into EQ, then we go into filtering. But that's not how I like to mix. We can actually change that, just as we did with the split on the filter section, which puts that processing before everything. We have an option to switch the EQ and the compressor. So like I said, by default, we got compressor, then going into EQ, but you'll find that a lot of the times I like to EQ before compression, and the easiest way to do that is to just hit this channel out button. So that basically tells the compressor or the dynamic section to happen after the EQ. All right. And that way I like to get that SSL sound, and this is how you get that SSL sound. I like to use this channel out button to boost signal going into the compressor, so that compressor can work just a little bit hard and I get a little bit more of that spank. All right. Finally, we got our output section, because what you got going in is what you should have going out. Okay, we don't want to fall into that louder is better mentality, or we don't want to do anything that affects the signal in the long term. We want to make sure the adjustments that we're making is not sounding good because it's louder. We want to make sure the adjustments that we're making sounds good because it sounds good. So I do use this output knob, and especially if I'm using the input section. Okay, so if I'm inputting 6 dB, before I do any processing, I'm outputting by -6 dB. Okay, so if I got +6 dB going in on the input, we got -6 going out. With all that said, that is the essential functions of a channel strip. I mean, look at the Avid channel strip compared to the SSL EV2, right? Basically your same functions. You got your expander gate, you got your compressor, you have your EQ, and then you got your output knobs, which is right here. Yeah. So you got your input, you got your phase reverse, EQ, compression, expander, output. You know, it's the same. It's the same thing. All right. I highly believe that you should be using channel strips just to get your mix started, just to get those basic functions out the way. You know you're going to have to probably EQ. You know you're going to probably have to compress. I don't want to spend time trying to find the right compressor or the right EQ, okay? I want an EQ and a compressor to do its job, and that's the EQ and compress, all right? If I find that I need to tweak the mix a little bit more, then I have no problem going to outboard gear. Then I have no problem, I have no problem going towards an 1176 or a 2A or a 670 or a DBX 160. I'm just naming out a bunch of compressors, but regardless, I don't want to have to spend time trying to figure out how do I want to attack this. One essential plugin to fix 4 or 5 different problems. Okay, so what more could you ask for? I believe this gets your mix done faster. And speaking of getting your mix done faster, using channel strips is a part of my 7 concepts of efficient mixing. It's a free guide that I put together for you, just for you, to learn how to get your mixes done faster, better, efficient, right? So you're cranking out more music. You don't spend time tweaking every little element of your mix. You spend more time getting mixes out or getting songs out, if you're an artist, to your fans, okay? So that link is in the description below. If you want to check that out, grab it. It's yours. I'm not charging you for it, so who can argue with free, right? So with that said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching. Peace.